Personality and gender differences in adulthood. It is clear from everyday observation that people differ in predictable ways in their tendency to show aggressive behavior. Some go mad at the slightest provocation, others are almost impossible to fall out with, and there is a broad spectrum in between. In this chapter, we will take a closer look at variables associated with individual differences in aggressive behavior in adulthood. The first part of the chapter reviews the evidence on personality variables that can help to clarify some of the processes underlying differences in the general tendency to show aggressive behavior. This discussion will focus on research with a primary focus on individual differences in aggression. Studies considering personality variables as moderators of particular forms of aggression, such as intimate partner violence or aggressive driving, will be reviewed in their respective contexts. The second part of the chapter is devoted to the topic of gender differences in aggressive behavior. In this part, the stereotypical belief that men are more aggressive than women will be put to the test of systematic empirical investigation, leading to a more complex picture of when and why men and women may differ in aggressive behavior. Personality constructs related to aggression. According to the General Aggression Model, GAM, presented in Chapter 2, personality variables play an important role in explaining aggressive behavior. Personality variables are conceptualized as traits that are relatively stable over time and can help to explain why not all people behave equally aggressively in the same situation. In this section, personality traits will be discussed that have been linked to individual differences in aggressive behavior through shaping both affective and cognitive processes. In addition, the role of stable differences in self-esteem and self-regulation will be examined in relation to their effects on aggressive behavior. Evidence of significant associations between personality constructs and aggressive behavior in everyday situations and in controlled laboratory experiments will be discussed. Consistent with our social psychological perspective, we will focus on constructs that play a role in explaining stable differences in aggression in everyday interactions, excluding constructs that are primarily relevant for explaining severe forms of aggression and violence in the context of psychopathology and criminal offending. A summary of the main personality constructs and their relationship with aggression is presented in Table 4.1. Table 4.1. Personality variables associated with individual differences in aggression. Associated with higher aggression, trait aggression, anger and hostility, irritability and emotional susceptibility, rumination, hostile attributional style, narcissism. Associated with lower aggression, dissipation, perspective taking and empathy, self-control, trait aggressiveness, anger, and hostility. Stable individual differences in the tendency to engage in aggressive behavior are captured in the construct of trait aggression, which is typically measured by self-report instruments. One prominent measure, the Buss-Perry Aggression Questionnaire, AQ, was introduced in Chapter 1, and its validity and reliability have been demonstrated in many studies. Validating the construct of trait aggression, a large body of research has shown that people scoring higher on measures of trait aggression are more likely to show aggressive behavior in specific situations than individuals with lower trait aggression. Moreover, as conceptualized by the General Aggression Model, GAM, see Chapter 2, trait aggressiveness has been shown to moderate the influence of situational factors eliciting aggressive behavior. For example, exposure to violent film clips led to more aggressive behavior in individuals scoring high versus low in trait aggression. Trait aggressiveness denotes stable differences between individuals in the likelihood and intensity of aggressive behavior. As reflected in measures such as the AQ, trait aggression is a multidimensional construct composed of both behavioral aspects, physical and verbal aggression, and affective and cognitive components, anger and hostility. As shown in Chapter 2, Anger and hostility are considered by several theoretical accounts of aggression as key components of trait aggressiveness. Anger involves physiological arousal and preparation for aggression and represents the emotional or affective component of trait aggression. Hostility consists of feelings of ill will and injustice and represents the cognitive component. See also the section on hostile attributional style below. There is ample evidence that individuals who are habitually prone to anger and hostility show more aggressive behavior in situations that elicit these affective and cognitive responses. A prominent instrument for measuring both the trait and the state component of anger is the State Trait Anger Expression Inventory, STAXI, by Spielberger, 1996, which has been validated in many studies. In a meta-analysis by Betancourt et al., 2006, trait anger was established as a significant predictor of aggressive behavior following a provocation. A study by Taffret et al., 2002, found that individuals who scored high on trait anger experienced more anger episodes that lasted for longer periods of time and were more likely to involve verbal aggression on their part than those who scored low on trait anger. See also Chapter 3 for developmental pathways into trait aggression. Irritability and emotional susceptibility. Irritability refers to the habitual tendency to react impulsively, controversially, or rudely at the slightest provocation or disagreement. Caprera et al., 1994. Habitually irritable people, as identified by the Caprera Irritability Scale, which consists of such items as, I think I am rather touchy, were found to show increased levels of aggression compared with non-irritable individuals. The difference was particularly pronounced in response to a frustration. Similarly, irritability augmented the differences in aggressive behavior observed in response to exposure to aggressive cues. In a study by Giancola, 2002, highly irritable participants selected more painful electric shocks for an alleged co-participant as a measure of aggressive behavior. See Chapter 1. Drinking alcohol increased aggressive behavior in highly irritable but not in less irritable participants, although this pattern was only found for the male participants. The meta-analysis by Betancourt et al., 2006, confirmed the link between trait irritability and situational aggression across a broader range of studies. Emotional susceptibility is defined as an individual's tendency to experience feelings of discomfort, helplessness, inadequacy, and vulnerability. Like irritability, it is presumed to indicate a generally increased readiness or lower threshold for aggressive behavior. The findings reported by Caprera and his colleagues for emotional susceptibility largely parallel the effects they found for irritability. Emotionally susceptible participants showed more aggressive behavior, particularly following prior frustration. In addition, they showed a larger increase in aggression following physical exercise, lending support to Zillman's excitation transfer model. The meta-analysis by Betancourt et al., 2006, also found that individual differences in emotional susceptibility predicted aggressive behavior, particularly following provocation. The two constructs of irritability and emotional susceptibility may thus explain individual differences in affective or hostile aggression. Irritability, habitual tendency to react impulsively, controversially, or rudely at the slightest provocation or disagreement. Rumination and dissipation. Rumination and dissipation are two constructs referring to cognitive processes linked to individual differences in aggression. They represent the opposite poles of a continuum that describes the extent to which people are preoccupied with angry thoughts following an aggression-eliciting stimulus. Anger rumination is defined as perseverative thinking about a personally meaningful anger-inducing event. Low ruminators, high dissipators, quickly get over a provocative or hostile encounter without investing much time and effort in thinking about the experience, By contrast, ruminators have a tendency to mull over the aggression-eliciting situation for extended periods of time and are more likely to plan and engage in retaliation. In order for ruminative versus dissipative tendencies to show an effect, sufficient time must be allowed between the hostile or provoking stimulus event and the aggressive response. The more time elapses, an aggressive reaction will become less likely in dissipators, but more likely in ruminators. People holding the metacognitive belief about themselves that they are prone to habitually ruminate over anger-eliciting events scored higher on measures of anger and displaced aggression, and the link was mediated by increased anger rumination. Anger rumination, perseverative thinking about a personally meaningful anger-inducing event. Although some people may be generally more prone to rumination than others in all areas of life, the contents of the ruminative thoughts are important for the link with aggression. Pellet and Moretti, 2010, showed that only the tendency to ruminate about anger was linked to aggression, whereas the tendency to ruminate about feelings of sadness was associated with depression. Similarly, Betancourt et al. 2006 found in their meta-analysis that trait rumination was associated with observed aggressive behavior only in the context of provocation. Later studies showed that participants were more likely to show aggressive behavior after a frustration or when intoxicated, the higher they scored on a measure of anger rumination. These findings highlight once more the interaction between the person, the tendency to ruminate, and the situation, the elicitation of anger, in explaining aggressive behavior. Although dissipation rumination is conceptualized as a stable individual difference variable, it is possible to demonstrate the role of rumination or dissipation by inducing the two modes in experimental situations. In a study in which participants were either instructed to ruminate about a provocation or distracted from thinking about it, those in the rumination condition reported significantly higher levels of anger after a 25-minute interval, and also showed more aggressive behavior after a minor triggering event. Further clarifying the path from rumination to aggression, a series of studies by Denson et al. 2011 showed that rumination leads to a reduction in self-control, which in turn lowers the threshold for aggressive behavior. We shall return to the link between low self-control and aggression later in this chapter. Hostile attributional style and perspective taking. Hostile attributional style, defined as a person's habitual tendency to interpret the ambiguous behavior of others as an expression of their hostile intent, has already been discussed in Chapter 3 in relation to the development of aggressive behavior in childhood and adolescence. It also features as a personality correlate of aggression in adults. Attributional style not only affects the way in which people interpret actions directed at them individually, but also shapes their social perceptions in general. As Dill et al. 1997 graphically described it, these people tend to view the world through blood-red tinted glasses. Attributional style is a cognitive disposition and does not depend on the experience of affective arousal, i.e. anger, as a result of being personally affected by others' apparently hostile actions. However, this cognitive disposition may go hand in hand with affect-based dispositions towards aggression. Dill et al. 1997 showed that irritability and trait aggressiveness predicted the extent to which participants attributed aggressive thoughts to the actor in a scenario describing an ambiguous social interaction. In a systematic review of 25 studies, Twente et al. 2019 found small to medium-sized correlations between hostile attributional style and self-reported aggression in adults, with no evidence for gender differences. The finding that the association was closer for reactive than for proactive aggression is consistent with the conceptualization of hostile attributional style as a cognitive schema about the intentions of others, to which the perceiver then shows a behavioral response in the form of aggression. The hostile attributional style can be seen as part of a person's aggressive script that is shaped through social experience, as described in Chapter 2. The more often an aggressive script is rehearsed, the more easily hostile schemata can be accessed, promoting the tendency to interpret the behavior of others as an expression of hostile intent. Huseman, 1998. Thus, aggressive behavior and hostile attributions are mutually reinforcing. Tangaraki et al., 2008, demonstrated that distorted memory plays an important part in this process. They gave participants word lists containing neutral and violence-related terms and asked them to recall which of the words had been presented in an earlier phase of the experiment. Highly aggressive participants were significantly more likely to falsely remember violent words as having been included in the earlier list. A parallel but weaker effect was found for a situational manipulation in which participants were primed by reading a word list referring to insults, e.g., idiot, loser, incompetent, or were given a list of neutral words. Those who had seen the insult-related words were more likely to falsely remember having seen violent words than those who had received the neutral words. Hostile attributional style is seen as an important variable contributing to individual differences in trait anger, as noted by Wilskowski and Robinson, 2008. However, these authors argue that angry individuals are not only prone to fast and automatic, hostile interpretations of situational cues, they are also less likely to engage in more effortful cognitive processes that might correct the initial hostile attributions. The failure to revise spontaneous hostile attributions through more elaborate information processing was also stressed by Dodge, 2006, in his developmental account of the hostile attribution bias discussed in Chapter 3. Whereas the hostile attribution bias enhances aggressive behavior, perspective taking is a cognitive variable associated with the inhibition of aggressive responses. Perspective taking refers to a person's ability to orient him or herself non-egocentrically to the perspective of another person. In the developmental literature, deficits in children's ability to develop a mental representation of the internal state of others, called theory of mind, has been linked to aggressive behavior, as discussed in Chapter 3. The role of perspective taking in inhibiting aggressive behavior has been established by a variety of studies. Perspective taking, ability to orient oneself non-egocentrically to the perspective of another person. For example, Richardson et al. 1994 showed that individuals who scored high on dispositional perspective taking were less likely to report aggressive behavior and also less likely to respond in an aggressive way to a provocation. In a later study, Richardson et al. 1998 found that individuals who scored high on dispositional perspective taking were more likely to choose a non-aggressive response to a verbal attack as opposed to an aggressive response than low perspective takers. This was only true, however, if the attacker's verbal insults increased in aggressiveness from the beginning to the end of the interaction. If the verbal insults decreased from high to low levels during the interaction, no effect of perspective taking emerged. The need to understand an aggressive opponent's behavior is probably greater if the opponent's aggression becomes more extreme in the course of the interaction than if an initially aggressive opponent becomes less aggressive over time. Therefore, high perspective takers may have chosen non-aggressive, i.e., de-escalating responses, to a greater extent when the opponent showed increasing levels of aggression. The Big Five personality factors and honesty and humility. In a comprehensive meta-analysis, Jones et al. 2011 examined the evidence linking the Big Five personality factors of openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism to aggressive behavior across a diverse range of settings. They found significant associations for all five factors, whereby neuroticism was positively and the other four factors were negatively related to aggressive behavior. An updated meta-analysis by Vise et al. 2018 confirmed these conclusions for a more differentiated set of outcome variables, distinguishing between forms, physical and relational, and functions, proactive and reactive, of aggression, focusing specifically on the associations between the Big Five and aggressive behavior in the laboratory. Hayat et al. 2019 confirmed the significant but small associations for agreeableness and openness, both of which were negatively related to aggressive behavior. The other three factors were not systematically related to aggressive behavior in these specific settings. The Big Five personality factors have been brought in to include a sixth factor called honesty humility, HH, which comprises the four facets of sincerity, fairness, greed avoidance, and modesty. Individuals scoring low on this factor are thought to use flattery to get what they want, break the rules, are materialistic, and feel a strong sense of entitlement. Several studies have found higher tendencies to engage in aggressive behavior, assessed both via self-report and in experimental settings, in individuals scoring lower on the honesty humility factor.